Alright, good morning. My name is Lorenzo Armis, and today I will be presenting to you my line of reasoning. To start off, everything that I did was through a functional lens because I believe that one of the biggest problems with urban sprawl is the functionality and how productive it is. So, my first source that I used was the Conserve Energy Future What is Urban Sprawl source, but I only used it for a very simple purpose of introducing what urban sprawl is, because the source was written by Rinkesh Kakreja, however you say that, and he is described as an environmental enthusiast, and that's not very credible because he doesn't have any degrees or any actual qualifications to be talking about this. So I only used it to define urban sprawl because it's very simple and it doesn't need to come from a very credible source because it's so simple. This is, sorry, I was writing, sorry. My next source that I used was the New York Times. New York Times obviously is a very established magazine. It was established somewhere in the 1850s, so everyone knows this is credible. And what I used it for was to bring into my essay how in Lake Nona there is intertwined job infrastructure and residential infrastructure with the medical city, because there's a children's hospital, there's the veterans hospital, and there's also the medical research institution at UCF, but that's all very close to residential areas such as Laureate Park, Eagle Creek, and that is very much against the unfunctional flow of urban sprawl, where you have giant outcroppings of residential areas that cause traffic jams, lazy people always in their cars, etc. So the next source that I used was the Orlando Sentinel. Orlando Sentinel source written by Nassim S. Miller. What makes her credible and why I use this source was because if you look at her description, it says she has a master's in multimedia journalism, which obviously makes her very credible. And the reason I used this source after the New York Times source was because New York Times described the intertwined job infrastructure and residential infrastructure. So to build on top of that, I used this source because it was describing the smart home. And what the smart home is, it's basically like your iPhone was integrated with a home. It has UV lights on the kitchen counters to kill bacteria. It has toilets that can detect UTI infections, and it has cork floors that make for quiet and peaceful rooms. And what this does is make a more functional population in Lake Nona on top of the infrastructure, because the people make the city, and you need functional people to have a functional city. And then my next and last source was the Fortune source written by Jennifer Reingold. And if you look at her description, it says that she's received multiple awards. I can't speak on what degree she has because I couldn't find information on that, but she is credible because she's a chief editor at Fortune and she's received multiple awards. And the reason I use this source last is because the information that I derived from this source was the fact that Joe Lewis, who owns Tavistock, he's a billionaire, and he's funding most of what's happening at Lake Nona. So I went from New York Times to describe the basic outlay of Lake Nona, which is how you have job infrastructure and residential infrastructure. Then I went to I don't know what the other, how do I go back on this? Then I went to the Orlando Sentinel source to describe how the infrastructure is affecting the people. And then I went here to show that Joe Lewis, since he's the main funder, it makes everything a lot easier, because to get Lake Nona going and the gears turning, you don't have to convince a room of investors to all agree on the same thing. It's just Joe Lewis, and he's making the decisions, and he's willing to put a lot of money in and take high-risk investments. Thank you. What are your questions?